First of all, I want to welcome all you. Thank you very much for coming here to listen to several presentations on the zoo directive and the implementation of that one. I will start with a few opening remarks and then give the floor to Will Travers from the Born Free Foundation to present the reports that they've written so far. Why are we here today? We're here to discuss the implementation of the so-called zoos directive. And that sounds extremely impressive to have a zoos directive, but this is the zoos directive. It's about 2 pages and that's all. Nevertheless, it is important. We have people on this table who have done some serious research on the state of several zoos in a few European countries. They will continue their research. And we have 2 representatives from the European Commission, both from DG ENVI and DG Sanko. And I'm very happy that you're all here to respond to the first findings of the Born Free Foundation. Let me be clear about what this seminar is not about. This is not about getting rid of zoos and freeing all animals. That is not what we're talking about. This is about a way to try to make lives for animals in zoos better than it is now, if necessary, and to look at the implementation of this zoos directive. But let me first say a few things about zoos, because I'm a great fan of zoos, personally, and my children as well. And they play a very important role. I believe that zoos play a very important role in getting people involved in the whole issue of biodiversity. Children have their first experiences with nature, especially wild nature, through zoos. And I think without that experience, children and later when they become adults will have less feelings for nature than they will have with visits to zoos. So I think that's a very, very, very important reason why we should continue having zoos. The other is education. Many zoos have very good educational programs for schools, children's, etc., etc. And the third reason is that some of the best zoos play a very important role in biodiversity. Their breeding programs are very important for avoiding the extinction of certain species. I believe there are more tigers in captivity nowadays than there are in the free world. So we might even need zoos to save the tiger in the future. So zoos play a very important role, but that doesn't mean that all zoos are perfect. And I'm very happy that the Born Free Foundation has taken the initiative to investigate zoos. They have been doing that, first of all, in 5 countries of the EU, Bulgaria, Ireland, Cyprus, Greece, and Romania, and they will continue doing so in other countries as well, but both Will Travers and Daniel Turner will respond on that later, and also on their findings. I think it's very important that we make lives of animals better than it is now in certain zoos. This is not just a Western European thing where everything is okay and an Eastern and Southern European thing where everything is terrible, because I believe that one of the best zoos is in Prague, so it is possible to have both. It's not also just a matter of money. It is primarily a matter of knowledge, of training of people in zoos and veterinarians. I'm very happy that the Born Free Foundation is working very closely together with member states, other organizations, with the European Commission, so they're not trying to find all the negative things and confront member states with it. No, I think it's a perfect example of a sort of private-public partnership where an NGO like the Born Free Foundation is doing very, very good work, where we as from the public side can make use of. I'll keep it to that, and I would like to give Will Travers the floor. Will? Yes. There you are, yes. And start with your presentation of your first findings in these 5 countries.
Yes, it is. Okay. Well, Chairman, thank you very much indeed. And it's very pleasing and gratifying to see so many people here today, and to also acknowledge the presence of the Commission in 2 different aspects, and to thank also the ALDE, the Alliance of Liberals and Democrats for Europe, for hosting this session. I'm not going to actually get into any of the detail at all. I'm going to set the scene very briefly, and then Daniel is going to talk more specifically about the initial findings. And I'd want to pick up on a couple of remarks, Chairman, that you made. The first is that it's not, for example, all about money. Too many things today are all about money. But this is about money being spent wisely and about resources being targeted effectively. Zoos are an issue. They're a philosophical issue. There are those who are very supportive. There are those who are very critical from a philosophical point of view. But today, this isn't about philosophy. It is actually about ensuring that the laws that we have are properly applied. So briefly, some background. In 1987, I was in discussion with the then Environment Commissioner, Carlo Ripidimiana, and it was his personal interest in this issue that led to the European Union co-funding a survey that we did at that time in 1987-1988, looking at not so much the conditions in European zoos, but actually to try and get one piece of essential baseline data. How many zoos were there in Europe, and what kind of zoos? Large city, small municipal, countryside, theme park, aquaria, dolphinaria. How many zoos were there in Europe? And at the time, the best available list from the European Union was about 260 zoos. By the time we'd finished the survey, a year and a half later, we had identified 1,008 zoos. And I think it was an important starting point in the journey that led ultimately to the directive. And it has been quite a roller coaster journey. It's taken quite a long time. And at various stages in this journey, the directive has been reclassified, or potentially reclassified as a recommendation, and then it was revitalized as a directive again. And I have to say that the European Parliament played a significant role throughout a 10-year span of time, making sure that at the end of the day we ended up with a directive, albeit only a couple of pages. That directive focuses primarily on the conservation of biodiversity. That's the main underpinning theme of the directive. But it also clearly refers in 2 or 3 specific areas to animal welfare. It talks about animal husbandry. It talks about environmental enrichment. It talks about meeting the biological needs of the animals. And it talks about a preventative and curative veterinary regime. And so you cannot, I think, escape the fact that when wild animals are in captivity, even if your overarching objective is the conservation of biodiversity, you must pay attention to the welfare of the animals. And those who were at the press briefing earlier, forgive me if I'm going to be sort of repeating things you've already heard, but I attended and co-hosted a conference at Oxford University last September, which was discussing an issue, discussing a concept called compassionate conservation. Too often, on one end of the table sit the conservationists, and on the other end of the table sit the animal welfareists. And there are those who would like to characterize these as two disciplines that never meet. And we had some of the world's leading thinkers, leading practitioners, over 100 papers presented at that conference, and by the end of the 2.5 days, I can tell you, we all sat in the middle, because conservationists recognized that paying attention to welfare helps deliver better conservation and biodiversity outcomes. And I don't think there's anywhere where that is perhaps more evident than in a zoo. So the directive came in 2002, when there were 15 member states. In 2005, all member states needed to comply. That was the then 25 members. And then in 2009, of course, there were the 2 additional member states that joined. And as of now, what one would expect to see is that that all European zoos are licensed and that they meet a set of criteria, minimum criteria. The problem, one of the problems, and Daniel will go into more detail here, is that many people don't know what those minimum criteria are. There are no explanatory notes attached to the directive. You cannot pick up the directive and see what is meant by biological needs. And so, while some member states have produced their own extensive explanatory notes and guidance, others are currently isolated on this issue, and it's very important, in my view, that we are all up to speed. And the reason that it's very important, and this is my last point, and I'll hand over to Daniel, is because this isn't some peripheral, parochial, small, insignificant activity. We estimate that there are 4,000 zoos now in Europe that meet the definition. They contain millions of animals. There are hundreds of thousands of people employed either directly or in the service industries associated with zoos. I estimate that it's a €1 billion industry, $1 billion plus. And there are at least, in my view, 100 million public visits to European zoos every year. This is a major activity, and it is an outward-facing activity. It is not internalized. We are not talking about something that few of us can understand, like hedge fund managers. We're talking about zoos, which are public entities, sometimes publicly supported through public money, sometimes supported through the gate, but they are all outward-facing. They are there to be evaluated and judged and approved or not by the public. And therefore, my final point, if the European Union stands for quality, if Brand Europe stands for quality, then it is shameful that European zoos, as I think these reports will demonstrate, do not live up to public expectations and the intentions of those who drafted the directive in the first place. So there's a lot of work to be done, but I think a lot of work can be done, and we can achieve a great deal. And with that, I'm going to pass over to Daniel to give you a little more insight into the specifics in relation to the first tranche of reports and some of the themes that have come out of the work so far. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm over here. Hi. I want to take you back to when we first started looking at zoos in Europe, and this started with a project in Spain. And we were working with some local NGOs there and assessing the problems in those zoos. And what you see on the screen above me are generally what we found in that initial pilot study. Over the next 3 years, we looked at yet more zoos throughout Spain, and we were still finding those consistent problems. So what we wanted to look at was whether zoos throughout the EU had the same consistent problems, or whether that was just in the case of Spain. As you may know, Spain has recently been fined by the European courts in the sense that they have not been complying with the directive. The question is, should other member states have the same ruling, or should we give them an opportunity to meet the requirements by giving them the tools that they need? So I just want to give you an overview of our project, and as you will learn as I go on, it's an extremely extensive report, and you'll see some of us have reports that we have produced so far. We've published 5 of 20 reports, each on an individual country, a situation in an individual country. And then at the end of that series of reports, we'll be looking at the whole situation in the EU. And along the way, from the beginning till the end, we'll be working with the member states, with the Commission and with the Parliament to ensure that everyone is informed and to try and address those concerns that are being raised to us by the individual member states. So as far as our objectives, we were looking at the implementation of the directive in each member state, and we chose 20 out of the 27. We're looking at the effectiveness of the directive, and also whether the government and the competent authorities understand the requirements of the directive and whether they have the ability to actually apply it. We needed to see whether the zoos themselves were complying with the legislation, and for that reason we randomly selected from the 20 different countries a total of 200 zoos. We were looking at the inconsistencies in application and trying to find out the reasons behind it. And more importantly, and really I can't hammer this home enough, is that our aim is to work with the member states themselves to address the problems. So to give you an overview as to how we try to tackle those main objectives, is we've reviewed all national legislation. So that is translating it, interpreting it, understanding whether the requirements of the directive have been transposed effectively. We have met with the majority of member state competent authorities to get an understanding as to their knowledge and their abilities, but also by sending a questionnaire to each government as well, which I'll come on to in a minute. We visited and assessed all 200 zoos, and many of those I did myself. We undertook a scientific review of the data that we collected from the zoos based on the directive, the EASA standards, which is in the preamble to it's a recommended set of guidance, and also taking on board any further requirements that the individual country requires of their zoos. And we were looking at, we opened the dialogue, as I said, with the member states to ensure that they were kept informed why we were doing it and what our ultimate goals were. So the information to gather all that together was quite an undertaking, and obviously we had to do a large amount of research and information gathering. There were meetings with the competent authorities. We sent a questionnaire to all authorities, and not just the implementers, but also the enforcers and the veterinary services as well. And we visited the zoos, and we also gave the zoos an opportunity to respond about their practices, their performance in relation to conservation in particular, but also public education and protection of their animals. that information, all that data from the visits, from the questionnaires, from the websites, from the literature gathered at the zoos, from talking to the member states, was included into 5 main sections of analysis. So you can imagine all that data separated into 5 different areas. So it's the general zoo information, so whether the zoo is licensed under the directive. All zoos, as defined by the directive and the subsequent member states, need to be licensed, inspected regularly, and to meet the set of standards both within the directive and of the national law. And we were also looking at just the general information collected from the zoo visit. Conservation is the main aim of the directive, the conservation of biodiversity through the Convention of Biodiversity. And that's not just about captive breeding, it's also about how they educate the public on conservation, and also whether they contribute to in situ projects, so projects in the wild for wild animals. We were looking at education, so this is not just providing information about the animals they exhibit, the name, where they're from, what they eat, but also education about conservation of biodiversity and how the general public can get involved. That was the aim of the directive in the first place. We've talked about differences between the aims of the directive, conservation, but also welfare. And I'm sure that every member of the public visiting a zoo would want to know that the zoo is taking full responsibility for the animals that they keep, and that those animals are provided their basic needs, if not their species needs, as well as their species needs. So we looked at the enclosure quality, and this was undertaken by randomly selecting 30 enclosures from each zoo. So we didn't do every single enclosure, but a random selection of 30. And we also looked at the individual animals themselves, whether they appeared healthy, whether there was any abnormal behaviours that were identified, their general condition, and so forth. So where we undertook this work was 20 member states. The ideal would have been 27, but as always, resources are restricted. And so we generally chose countries that we knew needed help, and also places that had a lot of zoos as opposed to 1 or 2. So our general findings, and I'll come on to the actual facts and figures in a moment, but I think it's important just to spare a moment to have a look at the kind of facilities on how animals are actually kept in European zoos. And this is not just singling out the odd member state. This is general conditions that animals are kept in. And all the reports that we will be producing will have photographs taken during the assessment. And furthermore, online on the website that we're launching today, there are photographs for every country that we visited. Conditions generally very poor. So the overview, what were the results? Well, the directive has been transposed properly into the majority of member states. However, national laws lack the provisions and explanation to ensure correct interpretation of the requirements and guidance of best practice. So this is taking the theoretical requirements of the directive and the theoretical requirements of the member states' legislation and actually interpreting it and putting it into practice and ensuring compliance of those requirements. Competent authorities in member states are not effectively enforcing the requirements of the directive or their national law. Across the board, every single member state that we visited, all 20, has problems with enforcement and inspection. Varying degrees, but all of them have that problem. And this is mainly down to, as our discussions have identified, a lack of guidance, interpretation of the directive's requirements, and also in many countries a lack of knowledge and expertise on how to meet those requirements. Animals are being kept in substandard conditions, and unfortunately, in many cases, some really appalling conditions. And the directive in itself, as far as its objectives to conserve biodiversity, to ensure animals are provided their biological and conservation needs, and to ensure zoos across Europe are effectively licensed and inspected, is not meeting those goals. So, to identify those areas that need immediate assistance, and this is where I hope all of you can play a role in helping us achieve this, is that member state competent authorities do lack the knowledge and expertise to effectively interpret and apply requirements. How can we improve on that? Well, the directive is 2 pages of A4. There's no explanatory notes, there's no guidance, there's no help to understand what biological needs are or conservation needs are. So we need more guidance, we need more explanation. And this responsibility really lies with the people who wrote the directive in the first place and proposed the directive in the first place, the Commission. State veterinarians lack knowledge and expertise to effectively assess animal well-being, identify poor welfare, and address it. Veterinarians are very capable of looking at an animal and telling you whether it's ill or not. But it appears that European veterinarians are not so capable of telling you whether the environment the animal is kept in will provide the animal with their basic needs. And so that is the problem. It's actually identifying whether the welfare of the animal, whether the behavioral needs, psychological needs, physical needs are being provided for within that artificial space of that enclosure. Zoo operators in many member states do not know how to provide adequate care for the animals. If I can just give one example, and I'm not going to say which country it is, there was a series of concrete enclosures which were about so big. In the first concrete enclosure, there were some rabbits that had a hutch, they had straw, they were on concrete, but they had straw, they had abilities to forage, to seek shelter, and they had companions. In the next enclosure, there was a wolf, a social animal on its own, no bedding, no shelter, nothing but the concrete enclosure. And I asked whether the animal was being put there for any particular behavioural reason or welfare reason, and I was told not, that's its enclosure. Zoos are not meeting their responsibilities in relation to CBD, which is the Convention of Biodiversity, and particularly the conservation of biodiversity. And as I'm sure DG Environment of the Commission will inform us, is that the directive was written to conserve biodiversity. And what we're finding is that zoos are not doing that. And other issues of concern that I do want to raise, which are not as important as the previous, but still holding some importance, across the board inconsistencies, and this is not just between member states, but also between regions of member states, regions within member states even. Zoos are not providing adequate or correct information about the animals or information about conservation, biodiversity, or anything else. A lot of the zoos have shows which are entertainment focused. In a lot of places, zoos are using animals as props for photographic, like souvenir photographs of the experience. And in other places, individual animals are used for close encounter sessions, which some may argue, has a degree of education, but for the animal themselves, there's a degree of distress and fear involved in that situation. For the public, many circumstances I saw, people were being put at risk of physical injury, but also the transmission of zoonotic diseases. And these are diseases that are carried by vertebrate animals, mainly, that those diseases can be transported to public through touch or through the air, and then can harm people or can cause death. And we're talking things like salmonella for reptiles or birds, through to Ebola and hepatitis and so on in primates. And there were many situations where I came across people being put at risk and not being informed of that risk. And zoos are not taking sufficient measures to prevent the escape of wild animals. These are non-native wild animals into the natural environment of a country, completely exotic animal to the wild animals that are found in the environment. And invasive species is a huge issue for Europe. And we're finding that zoos are a major source of invasive species. So how can the Parliament help? And obviously we're sitting in the Parliament, so these are the areas that I hope you can help us with, because we are an individual organisation. We have a coalition that we work with, ENDCAP, of 32 organisations from 29 European countries, but we need the help and support of Parliament, Commission and the Member States to ensure that these issues are addressed, and the public. So please raise concern, raise awareness amongst the European Parliament, and take your concerns to the Commission, because they're hearing from us, but I think it would help also to hear from MEPs, to hear from committees within the Parliament, to hear from the public. Because the more voices raised, someone's likely to hear the needs that the things that we need. As far as the European policy of animal welfare, which is currently being drafted, and the impact assessment undertaken by DG Sanco at the moment, this is an opportunity to ensure all animals, regardless of circumstance or use in Europe, being provided their needs, their basic needs, the 5 freedoms, but why not their species-specific needs as well? That an elephant needs a different environment to a monkey, for example. So to establish a common understanding of what is animal welfare, because at the moment there isn't one, for veterinary training in captive wild animal welfare, the majority of vets have knowledge and experience with companion animals or domestic animals, but they don't have any experience of wild animals, and they're expected to go and identify animal welfare conditions in zoos. Best practice guidance for the keeping of animals. This doesn't need to be mandatory, and it's probably best if it isn't mandatory, but a general guidance that's going to help people to interpret what is required to meet the requirements of the law, and to go beyond that and to give some examples of best practice. There's many guidance out there. Some member states have taken that move and has produced very good guidance. But let's provide the opportunity for member states that don't have it to have it by telling them about it and giving member states the opportunity to meet and to share experience and knowledge. And this was an issue that was raised within the Paulsen report, which came from Parliament last year, that there is a need for a European network of reference centres. So an institution in each member state that can undertake research, that can provide expert knowledge, and to help the people that need the help. The funding that was submitted was turned down, unfortunately. But it is still an issue that is included within the European policy of animal welfare. And I think that it will and can play an important role in ensuring that these problems that we have identified are addressed, particularly through harmonisation of zoo inspection and the facilitation of knowledge and expertise. And lastly, and by no means least, we need you to pledge your support. If we don't know that you feel the same way we do, that things need to change, then please tell us. I'm here every month in Brussels for a week or so. Asked to have a meeting, asked to know more about things in your member state and how we are working with your government to ensure that the improvements are made. Thank you very much.
Daniel, thank you very much for your presentation. That is extremely helpful. This slide, how can Parliament help? You're talking about best practices. I wouldn't call my example best practice, it may be a practice, but we have political wolves and rabbits just in one cage here in this house. But it might be not a very good solution for the zoos in Europe. Thank you very much. I think your work is extremely helpful both for member states and the European Commission. And before giving the floor to the European Commission, I want to introduce Antonyia Parvanova and Chris Davies, who entered. After the presentation of the European Commission, I have to leave the room, unfortunately, but Antonyia will take over. And I would like to give Michael O'Brien, I think he's first, from DG ENVI, the floor.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. And firstly, my thanks to the members of Parliament who've actually organised this event today, particularly the Alliance for Liberal Democrats in Europe. I think it again demonstrates your commitment and interest in this subject, and we in the Commission are always aware of the topics that you feel are important through the context that you have with us. It's also important to make clear from the outset that we've had regular contacts with Daniel Turner in the context of his work in preparing this investigation. It is an independent investigation by ENDCAP and Born Free. It's not work commissioned by ourselves in the European Commission, but he has kept us abreast of the work that is under discussion today and in the coming months. Born Free, the very name itself, conjures up freedom of animals, and I think it would be fair to say that you are strong advocates of animal conservation in the wild. And I think that would also underpin our focus primarily on ensuring the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity has to be primarily focused on measures in the wild. And as you all will recall, 2010 was the International Year of Biodiversity, whereby we reflected on how much progress we were making both within the EU and globally. And I regret to say that we haven't achieved our objectives in relation to halting biodiversity loss. So we should not lose a perspective, and I'm not trying to take away from today's topic, of the urgency to address nature in the wild and making sure that animals that actually are reintroduced have a place to live. Obviously, in that context, we're developing a new EU biodiversity strategy. We set out our vision and targets last year, and we have important pieces of legislation, notably the Birds and Habitats Directive, the EU regulation giving effect to the Convention on Trade in Endangered Species, and other international agreements that we have signed up to. The Zoos Directive belongs to this family of legislation, and it recognises that there is a role for ex situ conservation or conservation outside the wild. And as Daniel has recalled, that the primary objective of the Zoos Directive is to promote wild animal species protection and conservation by strengthening the role of zoos in the conservation of biodiversity. Now, in relation to the broad question of ex situ conservation, we are in the process of reflecting at the moment in relation to how that operates for European species in the context of our strategies for halting biodiversity loss. The EU has co-financed and continues to do so various projects under the LIFE Fund, for example, which involve captive breeding, reintroduction of vultures and other species into the wild. And we want to be more strategic in making sure that this is well planned and thought, and that obviously zoos, aquaria, botanic gardens will all play their role in that context. Now, like all pieces of legislation, the zoos directive is directed to the member states, and they have a set of obligations. It's a slim directive, but there are clear obligations in it in relation to licensing, inspection of zoos, and to ensure that the zoos respect conservation protection requirements, and that includes appropriate accommodation of the animals. So there is, as people have highlighted, an animal welfare dimension to this. We have, over the years, taken action against member states where we have evidence brought to us that they have failed to comply with this legislation. I was just checking before this meeting, and I think there have been something like 24 different legal cases, and there are a few cases which are ongoing. This independent assessment which is being done for the countries obviously feeds into this process of reflection. I particularly welcome the fact that in preparing this, that there has been a consultation process with the member state authorities and with other stakeholders, because we always prefer in the Commission that if there are problems and issues, that they are first directed to the member states, and rather than coming to the Commission to go to the member states. It makes more sense that the member states are given the first right of answer in relation to matters of allegations against their compliance. And I would hope that such dialogue, both with the member state competent authorities, but also with those managing the zoos, including the European Association for Zoos and Aquaria, that dialogue would continue, because I believe that's essential for the way forward. I'm not in a position today to make a set of commitments in relation to the outcome of this work, other than to say that we in the Commission will examine any well-founded and substantiated allegations of a failure of compliance with this legislation. And we will obviously take the necessary action as a follow-up to that in the context of our role and in ensuring compliance with the different provisions of the legislation. And I expect that as a result of this work that we will have work to do. You have raised obviously some more substantive general issues, strategic issues of systemic needs, and of course we will have to reflect on that in terms of, for example, guidance in relation to biological needs. I expect that that's not an easy topic to get agreement on, depending on perspectives of what biological needs may be for different species. But it may be something that we will reflect on in the context of the more general conclusions that you draw from these studies. I haven't got into any detail about animal welfare, but my colleague Denis Simonin from DG Sanko, I think, will be able to give you more information in relation to the EU strategy on animal welfare. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. O'Brien. Now I pass directly the word to Mr. Simonin from DG Sanko.
Thank you very much. So I feel like an alien species here, because normally this is not my field of work to be here. I'm normally dealing with farm animals, so that's quite a different topic. So why I'm here, I'm working for DG Sanko, and as you may know, DG Sanko has in particular in its portfolio the animal welfare for production animals. But the fact is that we have worked since now 1 year on preparing a new strategy for animal welfare, which has been prepared in cooperation with DG Environment, because I mean a number of other files relating to animal welfare, like experimental animals and also the zoo directive, are also part more or less of the package that we have started to work on. And just for information, what is interesting is that we have we have launched last year an evaluation on the EU policy for animal welfare. And this evaluation has been completed recently, has been published on a specific website. And the evaluation includes, in particular, topics. I mean, it's not the main concern of the consultant, but it also includes some aspects concerning the zoo directive. So I think it's worthwhile having a look. It's an independent thing. It's not a commission document, but it's interesting. Now we are preparing the evaluation with the strategy for animal welfare for December 2011, if everything is working well. And there are two elements for us which are, of course, important, that in particular the opinion of the European Parliament, which was prepared by Mrs. Paulsen in May 2010. So for me, the role of DG Sanco is more an horizontal role. I mean, we are not dealing, I will not reply on specific issues dealing with the zoo directive, because this is the role of DG Environment. And the only thing for me is to see how, I would say, the zoo animals can fit with the overall strategy. And I saw at the presentation, and I identify at least 3 problems that are common and are not specifically to zoo directive. Enforcement is always a problem on animal welfare, so they are not alone. I mean, it's not an excuse, but this is an issue that also exists on farm animals. Communication, education, training is also an issue. Providing guidance, better training of officials and so on are also common problems that we found on animal welfare on other species. And something that has not been mentioned, but I would like to mention, because it has been mentioned in the evaluation, is the need for further research. The European Parliament pointed this out during its opinion on the previous action plan. But I think it's also important that, in particular, if you want to elaborate guidance, guides, making training and so on, you have also to have more research on the specific needs of the animals, how you can find solutions for specifically designed for zoo and so on. So I think that's the question of research is important, and according to the evaluation, there is no money given to the zoo animal, if I remember correctly. So these are 3 issues that are important to address, and they are horizontal, they are not specific. Now there are different options, and I mean, this is, I'm doing the impact assessment, so you don't know what it is, but there is a kind of formal systems to address problems. And one of the options is non-legislative tools, which means that there are things that you can do without adopting any new legislation. And on this, there are specific things that DG Environment can tackle directly. I mean, these are specific issues. For example, if they want to organize a training for officials on the zoo directive, that's their business, that's their budget. But we can also having within the strategy more horizontal approach. So that's, for example, we have a communications training, or we do training for official vets for other purposes, including animal welfare. And this we can handle, I would say, more horizontal issues, so that it could address several topics in the same, I would say, approach. So we can increase communication. We have training sessions for official vets. We can also make better communication of existing voluntary standards, translate them, making them on the web. I think the EASA has produced guidelines or things like this. So I mean, there are possibilities, and also, as has been mentioned, strengthening the coordination between member states by organizing working group and so on. So these are all things that can be done also horizontally or more specifically directed to zoo directive. So this is the first possible, I would say, options. And then we are going to more legislative actions, so a bit more complicated. And what has been suggested by the Parliament, there are 2 things. They have proposed some kind of general animal welfare law, and that could be designed based on animal welfare indicators. Can put as a requirement the fact that people dealing with live animals needs to be, for example, competent and trained. Introduce incentives to promote voluntary standards. There are a number of ideas that could be put in a general animal welfare law that are not specific, again, to the zoo directive. So this could be one of the possible way of reflecting this. Now, I don't want to, again, create promises because this is not my duty, but there might be some difficulties in terms of technicalities because, as has been said, the zoo directive is not based on animal welfare. We don't have legal base at EU level on animal welfare. We need, I mean, animal welfare has to be taken into consideration within the existing objective of the treaty. So it means that if you want to include all animal welfare, all animals in an animal welfare law, that might create some legal, I would say, difficulties. So, I mean, this might be a limitation of the exercise. Now, there is another thing that has been proposed by Born Free, which has been also proposed by the European Parliament and also studied by the Commission, is the establishment of a European network of reference center or center of expertise to some extent create a network of existing or new but mainly existing scientific resources in order to improve dissemination of knowledge, I would say create more practical innovation, how to reply to a number of practical needs for stakeholders, for officials who need to solve practical problems, and also to frame or organize the training at more, I would say, national or regional level. So these are the possible way of reflection at the moment on the strategy for animal welfare. And of course, since I'm still on the impact assessment process, if you have any specific views, you want to have a specific data that you think that might be interesting for us, if you have specific mechanism or model that could be interesting, if there are things that are working or that are not working, then please, you can contact me and we'll be very happy. Daniel knows me very well, so you have the contact point without any difficulties. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we are coming to the last panel, which is on the recommendations. Do you want to start first, or we put the Q&A session and then you do the recommendation? Okay, I think this is more meaningful. Then Chris Davies wants to have the first question, and then we continue. I would like to know who will volunteer for the answers.
Okay, the first question in 3 parts. First of all, to Daniel. Okay, your presentation understandably featured on poor practice, but across Europe there must be some really good examples of best practice. There must be examples to which other zoos can look to and say, look, you know, what we'd like to emulate those standards. And there must be guidelines and standards being produced by national authorities or bodies of zoos which can be copied and imitated. Perhaps you can touch upon that. Second part to Michael, really following on from that. I mean, okay, we've got a 4-page directive, but can the Commission help in promoting best practice and developing guidelines and encouraging take-up so that people don't have to invent the wheel? And finally, just to Will, I'm just looking at the posters, and of course, Born Free Foundation here seeks to phase out zoos, challenge the global captive animal industry. So, and yeah, of course, everything that is here that Daniel was and yourself is working on here in this instance is just trying to work to make the zoos we have better for the animals, to improve, you know, to meet the objectives of biodiversity and conservation and such like. Just how do you, seeing as I know some zoo organisations criticise this work because of the connection with Born Free Foundation, how do you respond to that? Who should, Daniel first?
I would have liked the last question. No. Best practice, yes. Obviously, there are zoos that perform better than others, and there are member states that perform better than others. And yes, they can learn from each other, but at the moment, there's no way that they can learn from each other. We have the European Association of Zoos and Aquaria, but they are 8% of the total number of zoos in Europe, and within their own association they require higher standards, but there's no outreach to the remaining zoos in Europe. The EASA zoos do not help other zoos in Europe, so you're still only going to have 8% of the total figure of zoos actually meeting the requirements. In the sense of the member states, I have to say I'm really encouraged by the member states that I'm working with on a regular basis at the moment. The 5 reports that we have produced, or the first 4 reports we've produced, I've met with all the governments now and working with the permanent representatives here in Brussels. Bulgaria, Greece, Cyprus and Romania already working on work plans that will address zoos and the problems we have identified in the individual reports. So I think it is a case of everyone needs to get together, work together, share experiences and share knowledge. But I think the Commission possibly needs to be the driving force behind that. And potentially, if there's a possibility of this, bringing member states together, so the competent authorities within each country together on a regular basis, so they can meet each other, talk to each other, and learn from each other's experience. And I think that's where you're going to get best practice.
It's a good question. And I think, you know, we are in the business of promoting good practice, sharing of experience between the member states. And I would hope, you know, as part of, there will be the individual country reports, and then there will hopefully be some synthesis arising from this study that can actually possibly identify not only weaknesses but some strengths. And if that's put on the table, then we will see in terms of how we can promote a better sharing of understanding. We've done it. I mean, we do it in terms of our nature legislation, for example. We've produced guidelines on hunting under the Birds Directive, which was a very controversial subject, still sometimes is, and with economic sectors such as wind, ports, energy extraction. My experience is that it sometimes can be a complicated process because what seems obvious and easy, there will be many perspectives. So it does take time. But if you can already identify elements of good practice and are willing to share them with us, and then we can open a debate as to how we might take that process forward.
Thank you very much for that question, Chris. Let me put it this way.
Sorry, just to put that in context, the reason I ask it is because, as you know, I've had letters from zoos saying this evidence can't be trusted because Born Free Foundation wants to get rid of all zoos.
Yes, no, yes, I know you've received those communications. Well, let me put it this way. We've been criticised equally by the more, I would say, radical end of the animal welfare movement for engaging in this process. So we're sort of damned if we do and we're damned if we don't. And I'd rather stand up and be counted than sit back and do absolutely nothing. As an organisation, we have 2 objectives. One is driven by welfare considerations and one is driven by conservation considerations. On the welfare front, we cannot stand back and ignore suffering if we see it. So the 2 dolphins that we've just rescued from a Turkish swimming pool, which would have been dead by now had we not stepped in, and we didn't have a plan and we don't have the money, but we stepped in because we could not stand back and see those animals die having been told about them. This is on a grander scale. This is the medium term. We are absolutely committed to reducing captive animal suffering, and the best tool for that is legislation. Without a question, the application of the directive effectively across Europe is going to deliver an uplift in welfare that we as a single organisation or even a member state cannot hope to deliver on their own. So we're absolutely committed to the process of delivering high quality legislation across Europe. And ultimately in the long term, and I did mention this at the start, it does end up as more of a philosophical debate, whether zoos are the future for wildlife or whether they are, as I would contend, only a part-time player in the future of wildlife, because the future of wildlife is in the wild, which was alluded to by DG Environment. It will be the public who will ultimately make that judgment call. We have to present the evidence, and I then think it's for the public to decide. And I would give you, on the conservation side, I will give you one example, which is pretty much uppermost in my mind at the moment. I work very closely with the Kenya Wildlife Service in Kenya. That is an organization with 4,000 employees. It's responsible for 6 million acres of land in Kenya. It is the custodian of Kenya's natural heritage. On that land, there are 35,000 wild elephants. There are 2,000 wild lions. There are 900 wild rhino, and everything else in between, from the microbe and the ant to the giraffe. The Los Angeles Zoo has just built a new enclosure for its elephants. Its solitary male elephant, now accompanied by 2 females that have just arrived. It has created a 6-acre enclosure, of which the elephants will have 3.8 acres. What's the connection between those two? The annual operating budget for the Kenya Wildlife Service is $45 million a year, and the cost of that enclosure in Los Angeles is $42 million. And I think those are the tough issues, the tough questions that need to be addressed. But that's not why we're here today. We're here about compliance and doing the best we can with what we've got. And I think through the Commission, we have a directive that has the potential to do enormous good. And I think it is our obligation to make sure that it does. That would be my response.
That's a very tough issue, actually. While listening to you, I was thinking what might have been, when you are talking about the public solution and the public judgment on this, is this this example that you gave at the end, is this an example of the unwise spending of public money? Shall we invest actually in capturing animals artificially? Is this part of preserving the biodiversity? Or is this a part of an example that we should invest more money at the natural parks like those in Kenya? Probably it's very difficult to judge. And when we talk about the role of the parliament, it's making even more complicated, and in terms of responsibility, even worse, because I could say that when it comes to implementation and enforcement of legislation which concerns European citizens, not animal welfare, we also struggle with finding legislative base for this, but also we also struggle with convincing member states that they should implement and enforce it, let's say, on some urgent issues, really according to the correlation table, if any. And as regard to animals, there is a lot of legislation concerning animals in this house, more probably one could say more than concerning human beings sometimes, but it doesn't mean that we are doing well. And when I read the reports, it doesn't seem to me that there is a member state which is actually, by so far, those which are mentioned in the report, which is doing quite well. When I read about my own country, it looked like 9 out of 10, or all 10 of the zoos are doing pretty bad. I felt somehow concerned and a little bit ashamed, but I didn't find a way actually to communicate this concern through any NGOs or to any organizations that could help to improve it and to use some pressure on the responsible authorities. Neither I was able to find actually a way that it should be, apart from this seminar, we are doing it the first time here in the Parliament, how we should communicate without creating more administrative burden and without creating more bureaucracy, to make the responsible authorities talking to each other and exchanging best practices. What's the best way actually to deal with this? This is a question mark. And any suggestions for further work will be, of course, welcome, but I will be more than happy if there are more questions and if we could have more suggestions. Where to go from now on? This is an open question.
I can answer that. I mean, Bulgaria is the best example I can use at the moment. Because, no, for seeing the progress, because we've produced the Bulgarian report. but I've been meeting with the officials in Sofia, and I've also been meeting with the permanent representative here in Brussels. And 2-3 days ago, we signed off the 2-year work plan, which has now been signed by the Deputy Minister for the Environment in Sofia. So this is a work plan that we have taken on board the recommendations of this report. They've taken on board the recommendations and they've looked at solutions and identified the solutions over a 2-year period. And Romania is doing the same, and Cyprus and Greece. And so that's the way forward. This is not just glossy reports that will sit on a shelf. This is this is the start of something new and a progress and a process. But we need support of the Parliament and the Commission, as well as the Member States, to see it to fruition.
Thank you, Antonyia. My name is Nessa Childers. I'm an MEP from Ireland. This may seem slightly off topic in a sense, but maybe it isn't. I'd like to ask Mr. Travers, when I was a local councillor, I made an attempt to bring in a bylaw to stop wild animals being used in circuses. And I failed because of political opposition to some degree, but also it turned out that it was a national issue, or so they said. I'm just wondering, do you ever deal with that issue? Because I think it could be revisited, you know, the animals in circuses, wild animals, because they were kept in the most appalling conditions. And I think Compassion in World Farming went underground with a video recorder to look at what was happening to them. So that's just...
Well, thank you for the opportunity to respond briefly to that. I mean, it is an issue that concerns us. For a long time, I personally sat on a parliamentary working group in the UK in 1996, 97 and 98 on the subject, and again in 2005, 6 and 7. And I jolly well hope I'm not going to be doing it in 2014, 15 and 16. It's a debate that's live, and the Labour administration almost got to the point, just before the last election, of bringing in an end to the use of wild animals in circuses. It is, in fact, Labour Party policy. It is also the policy of the Liberal Democrats. And we're waiting for the policy to be delivered by the minister responsible in the UK. I can only speak about the UK on this issue, Lord Henley, who is due imminently to provide us with the policy steer on this issue. But a word maybe to advise Lord Henley, there was a public consultation process that took place in the UK with more than 10,000 respondents in the early part of 2010, came just too late to be actually useful in the general election. Of the 10,000 or more respondents, which is a lot in a public consultation, 94.6% said that they wanted to see an end to the use of wild animals in circuses. So and that's where the public has made up its mind at the end of the day. And we've had animals as circuses with wild animals in the UK for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And at the end of that process, the public have sort of said enough is enough, and I hope that our elected representatives will heed that opinion. And it sort of takes me back to that earlier point that Chris raised, and maybe that's where the whole zoo thing will end up, but maybe in 100 years' time. Right now, we're talking about specific responsibilities within a legal framework, and that's what we have to focus on.
Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you very much. Other questions?
Ted Jury from the Sunday Express newspaper. Can I ask Michael O'Brien, you mentioned there were 24 prosecutions over the last X number of years. How many years is that? And also, can you name the cases that are ongoing?
I mentioned that there have been 24 cases of investigation in terms of mainly with regard to transposition of the legislation. We've heard earlier about the case against Spain, and obviously I think that's been a condemnation of the court. There is an open case against Cyprus at the moment as well. My point in this case was to emphasise that the Commission will take its responsibilities in relation to substantive evidence of a breach of the legislation. But simultaneously, we welcome the fact that in the context of this study, as is demonstrated by the Bulgarian example, that there is a debate with the authorities. Because if you know, there are facts brought to their attention, you may say they should know already, but that if they are responding in a strategic way, this is the best solution.
And one thing I have in mind on the involvement of the Parliament is that we always can have either a hearing within the ENVI committee or even in the plenary on the implementation and enforcement of the directive, and to make clear and to make the appropriate proposals further on in a resolution to the Commission and to Member States what should be done. This is a minor step, but it might help. I could not say that there will be a strong political commitment, but without doing such a thing and without bringing the comparison and bringing the data about the different practices in Member States, probably nobody will mention it, nobody will know. As, for example, I'm new into this topic, but it's worrying me. So I think it will be the case for most of my colleagues, and this is one initiative that we can take on board. If there are other proposals, of course, it will be helpful, but having, let's say, having oral question on the implementation and enforcement with resolution and discussion in the Parliament, do you think it might help? And I think the Commission can provide us with this communication and this information. Yeah, it is to you. Do you think it will help if the Parliament is actually using this procedural opportunity?
It's not for me to say what the Parliament should do, but I mean, obviously, I would hope that we will get the outcomes of the studies and maybe then reflect as to what are the strategic questions that would be raised before making kind of a decision as to kind of the Parliament that at the level and what. I mean, obviously what you say is interesting, but I would honestly wish to see, firstly, what are the outcome of the different studies, because there are 20 countries being investigated. It's a substantive piece of work. What are the systemic failures identified across all countries, because it seems every country has a problem in some way or other, then to see possibly what are the elements that will be needed both from the Commission's perspective and also particularly from the Member States' perspective. So I don't know if that answers your question in relation to this. It's an interesting suggestion, but possibly maybe at some future stage to enact it.
Can I just add to that, really, and to Antonia's point? I'm sure there's cross-party support for taking this forward, and that will strengthen as the additional 15 reports come out and concentrate the minds of people on their national situation. I commend the very constructive, positive approach that Born Free and Daniel have taken in developing this, in trying to bring on board the authorities to put in place a constructive programme of improvement. And within the Parliament, though, there are opportunities for us to take this further, both in the way that Antonia suggested, and of course using all the other instruments that are always open to parliamentarians in national parliaments and this place. One of which, of course, is just once all the reports are out and you've discussed with the Commission where you might be going, to talk to the Commissioner himself about it. I hope I'm not revealing too much, but I say that before the Commissioner became the Commissioner, I was the first person to mention the zoos directive to him, and he said, "We have a zoos directive?" I said, "Yeah, I'm afraid so." He said, "I better swat up about it." But so you'll have had about by the time we next see him on this subject, you'll have had about 2 years to swat up on it and to read your reports, so we can decide where we go from there.
There are actually, just to mention that if we have a directive in which most of the member states fail actually to implement it or to enforce it, it means either there is a problem with the directive as such, as a piece of legislation, or then there is more guidance needed or more time, or something is wrong in the entire perception of such a legislation or the notion of the existence, as actually it has been mentioned here, on the existence of the zoos as such. Then broader debate on this is needed. And you are absolutely right that we can communicate and we can help on this communication with the member states for preparing their action plans, but still, after having some experience in this House, and after having some experience in how we can require from member states to come up with national action plan and such on very important issues, as, for example, cancer, and there is a reason for mentioning it, and having the fact at the end that we end up with health inequalities of 6 and 7 times differences in cancer morbidity and mortality between member states, you can imagine what would have been on issue which is not even considered as a being of public importance or of urgence to take decisions. So in this regard, I don't want to say that I'm very skeptical, but I don't trust very much action plans, because I know how member states, after being strongly encouraged, this is the language that we use in our resolution, strongly encouraged to respond to any piece of legislation, activity, or whatsoever. They come up with these national plans to have a couple of years to the next generation of government to get inspected or whatsoever. So I don't see this as a very efficient way of actually ending up with positive outcome for the animals, at least.
So cynical.
I'd like to come back on that. I think what we're doing here is we haven't got to the end point. What we're doing is opening the debate here. We're not closing the debate. So we're raising the issue with the people that, with the member states themselves, and then the public in their member state, but then at a European level, at the Parliament and the Commission. So I think this is kind of the starting point, and we've got, I think, a long way to go before we reach where Born Free wants to be anyway. As far as the work plans are concerned, I think it's important to give the member states an opportunity to understand where they're going wrong in relation to doing the report through using science, and then talking to the member state to identify the solutions and to put a timeline on it. We're not talking 10 years down the road and they'll complete it. These are 2-year timelines. And where you're trying to change something legally, it's not going to take 5 minutes, it's going to take a while. So we talked about 2 years, and it's been agreed that 2 years is an adequate timeline to address all the problems that we have identified within each country. And then at the end, at the actual plan itself is going to be available on the website that this whole project is going to be based on, which I'll talk about hopefully in just a moment. Because from that website, everybody can go and see all the reports that are produced, and also there's going to be a table, an indicator as to which countries we've had meetings with, which countries have produced work plans, and with the country's permission to publish that work plan. So so everyone will see what the work plan is, and that way it makes it stronger. And from the Commission's point of view, the Commission can then take the decision as to whether if they're not achieving the work plan by the required timelines, then they could consider taking legal action, as they did with a number of other countries. So if I just want one last thing, it's just to give you an example, and perhaps maybe things are done in the wrong approach with some countries. Last week, I was in Bucharest, and I met with all the people working, all the competent authorities, from the veterinarians to the legislators to the enforcers of zoo legislation, zoo regulation in Romania. And at the end of my overview of the findings and recommendations and so on, which recognise that Romania has very good zoo legislation, it's just not effectively enforced. The comment from the highest representative there was that this is a breath of fresh air. Normally we're told we do things wrong, we never get things right, we never meet the standards of everyone else, and here's you saying that we're actually doing something right. And so perhaps we're approaching it from a better angle, that we're looking at the positives, we're recognising the positives, but by doing that, the negatives will be addressed better. And that's, I don't know whether that's going to happen, whether the work plans are going to be successful. But on meeting the Bulgarians, a month later, obviously taking on board it was Christmas, they have produced a work plan in a month. And so I think these are really positive steps. And I've had indications from Romania that they're also working on the work plan as we speak. So let's see.
Okay, that's a good wish for future work. It's first time actually here in my work in the Parliament to do concluding remarks with opening remark. But this is a good commitment finally, and we open actually the door for future work, and let's see how we can cooperate. You keep us informed on how these action plans are moving forward, and especially the action on them. And we will try to do our best what is possible under the responsibility and procedures of this House. And with good cooperation with NGOs and with the two DGs, with the Commission, I hope that we can achieve a step forward, as you said. If you accept this as a concluding remark, so I'm concluding with opening the door for further cooperation together, all of us. Thank you very much.